My name, Miriam Carter, 69, drives rideshare at dawn to afford rent. And this is my story. Before we continue, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and subscribe to Ivy's Stories channel. We're creating a community of people who know that our best chapters can happen at any age. It was 6:12 a.m. on a bitter January morning when I picked up my first passenger of the day. At 69, I had learned to drive through silence. Some drivers filled the air with small talk, but I didn't. After 30 years of losing everything that once made noise in my life, my husband, my home, my laughter, I preferred quiet. Quiet had no expectations. Quiet didn't leave. The app pinged softly. Arthur Glenn, Pickup City General Hospital. Destination Westwood Financial Plaza. Hospitals always made me uneasy. They smelled like endings. I turned onto the circular driveway. The automatic doors slid open, releasing a brief gust of warm air that smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. A man stepped out slowly. He was elderly, perhaps in his 80s, tall but fragile, with a neatly pressed gray overcoat and a dark cane that matched the brim of his fedora. His movements were deliberate, the kind that came from both age and pain. He paused when he saw my car, his eyes narrowing as if trying to focus on something far away. Then with slow determination, he walked toward me. I rolled down the window slightly. "Are you Mr. Glenn?" I asked, my voice steady but distant. He nodded. Yes, that's me." His voice trembled not from the cold, but from something older, deeper. I stepped out to open the back door for him, out of habit more than courtesy. That's when it happened. The moment he saw my face clearly in the morning light, his whole body froze. His gloved hand clutched the top of the car door for support. His eyes widened as if he had seen a ghost, and then to my astonishment, tears began to gather at the corners of his eyes. "Sir, are you all right?" I asked, startled. He didn't answer right away. His lips quivered before words came out broken and breathless. "Are you Margaret Carter?" he whispered. I frowned, confused. "No, my name's Miriam. Miriam Carter." At that, the old man's face went pale. His knees buckled slightly, and I thought for a moment he might collapse right there on the curb. I reached out instinctively, steadying his arm. His skin, even through the glove, felt cold and fragile like thin paper. He shook his head slowly, tears sliding freely down his cheeks now. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. It's just, you look exactly like her." Like who, I asked, though part of me didn't really want to know. He blinked rapidly as if waking from a trance and carefully lowered himself into the back seat. "Please, just drive. I'll explain. Later." The ride began in silence, broken only by the muffled hum of the tires on wet pavement and the faint buzz of the heater. I glanced at him through the rearview mirror. He was staring out the window, his reflection pale against the gray dawn, his jaw trembling slightly. Occasionally his eyes flicked up toward the mirror meeting mine before darting away again. Something in me stirred a feeling I hadn't felt in years. Pity, maybe, or unease. I wasn't sure. After a few minutes, I spoke softly. "Who is Margaret Carter?" He inhaled sharply. "Someone I owed my life to. Someone I thought was gone forever." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "And you think I look like her?" "Not look like," he said quietly. "You are her. The same eyes, the same face. It's impossible, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Forgive an old man's confusion. I wanted to tell him he was mistaken, that Margaret was just a name, that coincidences happened. But something in the way he said it, so certain, so full of reverence, made me hold my tongue. We stopped at a red light. The morning sun was beginning to rise, slicing through the fog and reflecting off the windshield. In that brief moment, I caught a glimpse of my own reflection beside his in the rearview mirror. My face lined, tired, mapped by time, did look eerily like the woman he was seeing in his mind. He leaned forward slightly. "Do you mind if I ask, was your husband's name David?" My heart stopped for a second. I turned my head sharply toward him. How do you know that?" He exhaled shakily, a small, broken laugh escaping his throat. Then with trembling fingers, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small yellowed photograph. The corners were worn, the image faded with decades of handling. He handed it to me with both hands, as though passing something sacred. In the photo, a young woman stood beside a man in front of a small diner. She wore an apron, her hair tied back, smiling at the camera with a brightness I no longer recognized in myself. The man beside her had one arm around her shoulders, and in his other hand, a wrench glinted in the sunlight. My fingers went cold. My throat tightened. The woman in the picture was me, or rather, the version of me that had existed nearly 40 years ago, before life had hollowed out all the laughter. Where did you get this?" I whispered. Arthur's voice trembled as he answered. "That's Margaret and David Carter, your husband. He saved my life. I owe your family everything." The air inside the car seemed to vanish. The only sound was the slow tick of the blinker and the faint hum of the engine. I stared at the photograph again, tracing the ghost of my younger self with my thumb. I could almost smell the diner's coffee, hear the clatter of plates, feel David's hand resting gently on my shoulder. That world had burned away long ago, but somehow this stranger had brought a piece of it back from the ashes. When the light turned green, I drove in silence. My chest ached with questions I didn't dare ask. Arthur sat back, his eyes still wet but calm now, as if a heavy burden had finally found a crack to escape through. "I've been searching for you for 30 years, he said softly, almost to himself. "I never thought fate would send you to pick me up." I didn't respond. The world outside blurred into streaks of gray and gold as the sun climbed higher. All I knew was that something I had buried decades ago, something I thought had died with David, was stirring back to life. And though I didn't yet understand it, that cold winter morning would be the beginning of the day everything I thought I knew about my past would change forever. When Arthur's trembling words echoed in my mind, "Your husband saved my life. I owe your family everything," I could feel something inside me unravel. The name David wasn't just a memory, it was a scar, a living, breathing ache that no number of winters could freeze over. That night, after dropping Arthur off, I parked my car outside the small apartment I rented above a laundromat. The neon lights flickered below the hum of machines washing strangers' clothes, filling the air. It smelled of detergent and loneliness. I took the old photograph he'd given me and set it on the kitchen table next to a chipped mug of tea, gone cold. The faces staring back at me were younger, brighter, untouched by betrayal. For a moment the lines on my hands blurred, and I was back there, 1993. The diner had been our second home. Carter's Corner Cafe was painted in red cursive letters above the door, the color long faded from years of sunlight and grease. Every morning the air smelled of coffee and fried bacon, and David would hum the same old tune from his army days while flipping pancakes. I used to joke that his singing was the secret ingredient in our success. We weren't rich, but we were steady. We had something that mattered: regulars who became family, a small house with a lemon tree out front, and a daughter who at least back then still called us Mom and Dad with affection. Angela was smart. Too smart, maybe. She'd always had that sharp way of looking at the world like she was already 10 steps ahead of everyone else. While David and I counted tips and scraped through the bills, she went to business school, graduated with honors, and came home with words we didn't fully understand: equity, liquidity, liability. She said she wanted to help us modernize, run things properly, and we believed her. It happened one afternoon in early May. The sunlight was streaming through the blinds, cutting the room into gold and shadow. David was sitting at the kitchen table, his face pale from weeks of exhaustion. The stroke had left him weak, slower to speak, slower to smile. Angela came in with a folder tucked under her arm. "Mom," she said softly, almost kindly, "we need to talk about finances." I remember laughing, trying to make it light. We've never had any to talk about. But she didn't laugh back. She sat down, spreading the documents across the table like a lawyer. "These are just authorizations," she explained, "so I can manage the diner and the mortgage while Dad recovers. It's only temporary." David's hand shook as he reached for mine. "Do you trust her?" he whispered. I looked at our daughter, her neatly pressed blouse, her confident tone, the way she avoided meeting my eyes. I wanted to say no. I wanted to ask why she was in such a hurry. But the words died in my throat. Instead, I nodded. "Of course. She's our daughter." I signed the papers. My name, Miriam Carter, in careful loops of blue ink. That was the last time my signature truly belonged to me. 3 months later, everything collapsed. The first call came from the bank. They said payments hadn't been made. I told them there must be a mistake. Angela was handling it. The second call came from our insurance agent asking why our policy had been terminated. The third came from the city office confirming foreclosure. The diner was locked one morning when we arrived. A padlock hung from the front door, and a red notice was taped to the glass property seized for defaulted payments. David stood there in silence. His left hand, the one still weak from the stroke, trembled against the door. I tried to hold him, but he wouldn't move. "She said she was taking care of it," I whispered. He looked at me, eyes hollow. "She did," he said, "just not for us." That night, I called every number I had for Angela. No answer. I left messages that turned from pleading to rage to silence. She never called back. Then came the fire. It was a humid night in August. I was dozing on the couch when the phone rang, a neighbor screaming about flames at the diner. By the time I arrived, it was already an inferno. The smell of burning grease and wood filled the air sirens, slicing through the night. Firefighters held me back as I screamed David's name. He had gone there earlier, he said, to check the books. I could still see the red and blue lights flashing across the smoke. Someone pulled me aside, a paramedic, I think, and said they'd found him inside, unconscious but breathing. He never woke up again. The next week, the insurance company called. The policy, they said, had been canceled 2 months before. Your daughter handled the account. The man on the phone told me, his tone flat, indifferent. I hung up without saying a word. The funeral was small. No flowers from Angela, no phone call, no note, just silence. After everyone left, I sat alone by David's grave, the wind tugging at the hem of my black dress. I pressed my hand against the fresh earth. She took the house, I whispered, voice cracking, but the silence she left behind was worse. In the months that followed, I lost everything: the diner, the house, my husband, and the version of myself that used to believe family was unbreakable. I moved from couch to couch, then to a room above the laundromat. I worked whatever jobs I could find, cleaning, cashiering, driving. I stopped speaking Angela's name. It became like a curse, a wound that would reopen every time someone asked if I had children. People said time heals, but time only teaches you to stop bleeding in public. Years later, when I held that yellowed photograph from Arthur Glenn, the one where David stood beside me smiling proudly in front of the diner, I realized something. The past doesn't stay buried. It lingers like smoke after a fire, clinging to your skin, your clothes, your breath. You can try to wash it off, but it never fully goes away. As I sat there that night staring at that photo, I could almost smell the burnt wood again. I could hear the fire crackling, the sirens wailing, the sound of everything I ever loved turning to ash. And yet, for the first time in years, I also felt something else faint, almost imperceptible. A pulse, a stirring. As if beneath the layers of grief and dust, my life was quietly beginning to breathe again. I didn't see Arthur Glenn again for 2 days after that strange morning in my car. But I couldn't stop thinking about him or about the photograph he'd given me. There was something in his eyes that morning, something between gratitude and unfinished business. And I knew deep down that whatever bound him to David wasn't over yet. On the third morning, as I was about to leave for another long day of driving, there was a knock at my door, slow, deliberate, and familiar. When I opened it, Arthur was standing there, wrapped in a long wool coat hat in hand, breathing hard as if he had walked farther than he should have. "Miriam," he said, voice raspy but steady. "I need you to come with me. There's something your husband left behind." Before I could ask, he reached into his coat pocket and placed a small brass key in my palm. It was old, its edges worn smooth from decades of use. A faded tag dangled from it with the numbers 431B etched by hand. A safety deposit box, Arthur explained, at Westbrook Savings. He opened it with me the week before. Before everything. I froze. Before the fire, Arthur nodded, his gaze heavy with memory. He told me, "If Miriam ever finds her way back, give her this." I didn't know what he meant at the time, but when I saw you the other day, I knew it was time. The key felt heavier than metal. It felt like the weight of 30 years collapsing into my palm. Westbrook Savings still stood on the corner of Main and Alder Street, a relic of a different era. The glass doors were new, but the bones of the building, the marble floors, the brass teller windows, hadn't changed since the 1950s. Arthur and I walked in together. The receptionist, a woman in her 20s with bright pink nails, smiled politely until she saw the key. Her brow furrowed. "Oh, wow," she said, holding it up against the light. "This must be from the dinosaur age." Arthur chuckled dryly. "I'm afraid that's about right." She led us downstairs to the vault, the air growing cooler and quieter with each step. The sound of the city faded until all that remained was the hum of old machinery and the rhythmic click of her heels on the tile floor. We stopped before a small metal door number, 431B, engraved faintly on its surface. "Funny thing," she murmured as she checked her tablet. "The rent for this box has been paid continuously for 30 years. Automatic renewals. No missed payments." I turned to Arthur. His expression didn't change, but his eyes glistened. "By who?" I asked. She scrolled through the records. Payments came from an anonymous trust, but the name on the original lease, David Carter. My knees weakened slightly, and I gripped the edge of the table for balance. For 3 decades, someone, maybe David, maybe someone acting for him, had been keeping this box alive, keeping a promise. The woman handed me a small silver key attached to a numbered tag. "Whenever you're ready, ma'am." The lock turned with a soft click that echoed in the stillness. I pulled the drawer out slowly. Inside was a plain wooden box about the size of a shoebox, its surface worn but clean. Arthur and I exchanged a look. Then I opened it. Inside were 3 things. A small gold ring, dull with age but still gleaming where the light hit the engraving M+D for Sakasern, forever. My breath caught. It was David's handwriting, those looping Ds always a little too tall. I remembered the night he gave it to me on our 15th anniversary, laughing that he couldn't afford diamonds but could promise eternity. Next to the ring was a stack of old bonds neatly folded and wrapped with a faded blue ribbon. The label read, U.S. Savings Bonds Series EE $250,000. Arthur leaned closer, eyes wide. Good Lord, he must have bought these years ago. And then the 3rd item, a sealed envelope yellowed at the edges, wax unbroken. My name written in that same familiar hand, for when she's ready to forgive. My fingers trembled as I lifted it. The paper was fragile, brittle, like memory itself. Arthur's voice broke the silence. He never stopped believing you'd come. I couldn't speak. The words caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. Arthur sat down slowly, his cane resting beside him. I used to meet David once a month at a diner just outside the city. After the fire, he changed. Said he couldn't face you. He was convinced you hated him for the debts for the house. He didn't know about Angela's betrayal. He thought the failure was his. I stared at the envelope, my reflection faint in the vault's dim light. He thought I hated him. Arthur nodded gently. He said, "If she ever forgives me, she deserves the truth." That's what's inside. I wanted to open it. God, I wanted to. But something stopped me. My hands refused to tear through time that quickly. "I'm not ready," I whispered. Arthur smiled sadly. "Then you keep it. The key brought you here for a reason. Maybe forgiveness isn't about him. Maybe it's about you. As we walked out of the bank, the winter sun was beginning to fade, streaking the sky in amber and rose. The brass key sat heavy in my pocket, the envelope even heavier in my coat. Outside, Arthur paused at the curb. "You know, he said your husband once told me that love is just unfinished forgiveness. That's why it never dies." He tipped his hat, smiled faintly, and walked away down the street, his cane tapping against the pavement until the sound disappeared into the hum of traffic. I stood there for a long time, the city moving around me like water around a rock. In my pocket was a ring that hadn't been on my hand in 30 years, and a letter I wasn't yet brave enough to open. And for the first time since David's death, I realized the story of our life together hadn't ended in the fire. It had just been waiting quietly for me to come back. For 2 nights, the envelope sat untouched on my kitchen table beside the old brass key, the faded photo, and my untouched cup of tea that had gone cold long ago. I would stare at it every morning before leaving for work, and again every night before turning off the lights. Each time I reached for it, and then stopped. Because somehow I knew that whatever was written inside would change the shape of everything I believed about David and maybe about myself. On the 3rd night, I gave in. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the rain tapping softly against the window. I turned off the lights, lit a single candle, and sat down. The envelope felt fragile in my hands, thin as breath. I broke the wax seal carefully, like undressing a wound that had been covered for decades. The first line was written in his familiar looping script. "Miriam, if you are reading this, it means I failed in every way a man can fail the woman he loves." I swallowed hard, reading on. He began with the story I never knew, a story that belonged to a time before me. Years before we opened the diner, he wrote, "I worked at a factory in Riverbend. One night there was a fire, a bad one. Arthur Glenn was trapped in the storage wing. I went in after him. The roof came down before the fire trucks arrived. My hands trembled as I turned the page. Arthur survived. I didn't just pull him out, I gave him half of my life. He promised to repay me one day. I told him he already had." The next paragraph was written with heavier ink, as though he had pressed the pen harder into the paper, forcing the truth through his shame. He tried to give me part of his company shares that could have changed our lives. But I refused. I didn't want charity, I wanted pride. That was my first mistake. I paused, feeling tears well up. Pride. It had always been David's compass, his strength and his curse. The letter continued his words, unraveling like smoke. "Years later, Arthur created a secret trust for you. He said it was to thank me to make sure you'd be safe. I didn't tell you, Miriam. I wanted to surprise you, to finally give you something that didn't come from struggle." Then the handwriting shifted, shakier, uneven. But Angela found out. My stomach clenched. She came to the house one night while you were working the late shift. She had the papers, the trust documents, and told me she could handle the transfer better. She said she'd turn it into investments, double it for our retirement. I wanted to believe her. The next line broke me. When I hesitated, she smiled that same cold smile she got from me and said, "Love was a weakness. Maybe she learned that from watching me beg." I froze. Beg. He continued describing how she had placed the documents before him, how he had tried to read to understand, but his hands were shaking from the early signs of his illness. How she'd raised her voice, accused him of not trusting his own daughter. How she'd cried crocodile tears and told him he was in the way of her future. Then came the confession that shattered me. I signed them, not because I trusted her, because I couldn't bear losing her too. He described the moment after, how she had gathered the papers, kissed his cheek, and walked away without looking back. She took everything that day, the trust, the shares, the house, and left behind a silence that could drown a man. I could almost hear his voice as I read that soft rumble I hadn't heard in decades, the one that used to calm me when the world felt too big. But in the words on the page, I could also hear his exhaustion, his regret, his understanding of what he had allowed to happen. "When the diner burned, I thought it was my punishment," he wrote. I thought God was collecting on every debt I had ignored. But Arthur found me after. He told me the truth that the trust had still existed, that Angela had taken control but couldn't erase you completely. He set up another fund in secret under my name. He said it would be there when you were ready to forgive. The candle flickered, and the wax ran down the table like tears. I wanted to tell you everything the letter continued, but shame became my shadow. I couldn't stand to see the disappointment in your eyes. You loved me too purely, Miriam. I didn't know how to hold that kind of grace. I let pride destroy us. Then near the end of the letter, his handwriting steadied again, as if he had gathered the last of his strength. If you are reading this, it means I am gone. But I want you to know I never stopped believing in you. You were the anchor in a storm I created. I thought I was protecting you, but in truth I was only protecting my own pride. Forgive me if not for what I did, then for what I failed to do. And then a final line, the one that broke me open completely. Tell Arthur thank you. Tell Angela I loved her anyway. And if you ever find peace, let it burn away what's left of me. I sat there for a long time, the letter trembling in my hands. The room felt too quiet, too still. My breath came out in shallow bursts. For 30 years, I had hated a man who had died, carrying guilt that was never his. David hadn't been weak, he'd been human. A father who had begged for love, a husband who had drowned in silence, a man who tried to hold a family together with hands that were already breaking. Tears spilled down my face, landing on the paper, smudging the ink. I pressed my palm over the words, like I could touch him through them, like the warmth of my skin could reach through the decades that separated us. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street was empty, washed clean by the storm. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and held it against my heart. For years I had carried anger like armor, thinking it protected me. But in that moment, I understood forgiveness wasn't surrender. It was release. David had died believing he was unforgiven. I whispered into the dark, "You were wrong, love. I just didn't know how to forgive until now." And as the candle burned lower, its flame bending but not breaking, I finally felt what peace might sound like, the quiet after fire. The rain had been falling for hours, steady and relentless, turning the city into a blur of glistening lights and rippling puddles. I'd been driving since dusk, the windshield wipers moving in tired rhythm like an old heartbeat. The roads were slick and empty, and my body ached the way it always did when silence stayed too long. The letter still sat in the glove compartment, folded neatly unread again, but no longer heavy. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was a memory with edges smoothed down by understanding. I had promised myself that after reading it, I would stop driving nights. I would slow down, maybe start living again. But here I was, chasing the comfort of motion. Driving had become my way of breathing the engine's hum, filling the space where grief used to echo. It was a little past midnight when the request pinged through my phone. Pick up Maple and 5th, destination Riverbend Apartments. I accepted without thinking. The rain thickened as I pulled up. A young woman stood under a flickering streetlight soaked through her denim jacket, her makeup running like ink down a page. She clutched a tote bag to her chest as if it were all she had left in the world. When she opened the door, a cold gust of rain followed her in. "Are you Miriam?" she asked, voice trembling. "Yes, dear." "Hop in." She slid into the back seat, shivering. Her hands were empty except for a cracked phone and a small wallet. She looked no older than 28. We drove in silence for a while, the wipers slicing through the downpour. Then softly she said, "He took everything." I glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale lips trembling between anger and disbelief. "Who?" I asked. "My boyfriend," she said. "Well, ex, I guess." A short, hollow laugh escaped her lips. "He said I was terrible with money, so he offered to manage it for me. I thought it was love. Turns out it was a lesson." Her voice cracked on that last word. I tightened my grip on the wheel. A lesson. How many times had I said that to myself after Angela, after David, after the fire? that the pain was some kind of lesson, as if learning could erase what was lost. "What's your name, sweetheart?" I asked gently. "Ruby. Pretty name." She smiled weakly. "My mom picked it because she said rubies don't scratch easy." There was a long pause before she added, almost whispering, "But I think she was wrong." I looked at her again through the mirror. The dim streetlight outside reflected her face, and for a moment I saw someone else, a woman in her 40s, sitting in a hospital hallway still in her diner uniform, hands shaking as a doctor told her husband wouldn't wake up. Me. It was like looking at a photograph that had aged into another person's life. "Ruby," I said quietly. "How much did he take?" She hesitated. "Everything. My savings, my rent money, even the money for my mom's medicine. I thought if I gave him control, he'd finally stop calling me stupid." My chest tightened. I remembered the day I'd signed Angela's papers, the same kind of trust dressed up as love. The car fell silent except for the patter of rain. Then, without really deciding, I pulled over beside a small diner, the kind that never closes, where lonely people go to remember who they used to be. Ruby looked up. "Is something wrong?" "No," I said. "Something's right." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a single $20 bill, the last one I had in cash. I'd been saving it for gas, but somehow that didn't seem to matter now. I handed it back to her. She frowned. "I can't take that." "You can," I said, "and you will." Her eyes welled up. "But why? You don't even know me." I turned to meet her gaze through the mirror. "Because I used to be you." The words slipped out before I could stop them, not rehearsed, not polished, but raw. She blinked. "What do you mean?" I hesitated. The truth wasn't easy to give away even after 30 years. I trusted someone once, my daughter, and when she betrayed me, I thought the world had ended. But it didn't. I did. Inside. Ruby's expression softened. "Did you ever get it back?" "The money?" I smiled faintly. "No, but I found something better, the part of me that she couldn't steal." For a moment we just sat there, two women from different generations, bound by the same invisible thread, trust, broken hope, bruised, but hearts still beating. Ruby wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "I don't know what to do now." I took a slow breath. "You start small, you eat something warm, you rest, and then tomorrow you remind yourself that kindness is the only thing that can't be taken." She nodded, looking down at the bill in her hands. "I don't think I'll ever trust anyone again." I looked back at her, my voice quiet but firm. "Don't let betrayal make you cruel. That's how it wins." The rain eased outside, softening into a mist. The neon sign of the diner flickered red and blue against the windshield, bathing us both in its glow. Ruby smiled just barely. "You sound like my mom." "Good," I said. "Then listen to me the way you'd listen to her." She laughed, a small trembling sound, but it was laughter nonetheless. I watched her step out into the rain, clutching her bag tighter, shoulders straighter. She turned back once and waved before heading into the diner. I sat there for a long while, watching her disappear behind the glass doors. Then I looked up into the rearview mirror again. This time I didn't see Ruby. I didn't even see the tired old woman I'd become. I saw the reflection of someone steady, someone who had survived betrayal, grief and guilt, and still had the strength to hand a stranger her last $20. It wasn't pride that filled me. It was peace. Because I finally understood what David had meant when he wrote, "Love isn't weakness, it's what survives the fire." The rain had stopped completely now. I turned the key and the car hummed to life. The mirror caught the faint glow of the diner behind me. Two silhouettes inside, one young, one old, like reflections of the same story told twice. As I drove away, I whispered to the empty seat beside me, "See David. You were right. Love doesn't burn out. It just changes hands." And in that quiet moment between night and dawn, I realized I was no longer driving to escape the past. I was driving toward everything I still had left to give. The next morning dawned gray, the kind of colorless light that feels like a warning. I woke before the alarm, the sound of rain still whispering on the window. My hands trembled slightly as I poured coffee, though I wasn't sure if it was the caffeine or the thought of what I was about to do. Arthur's words from the day before echoed in my mind. He never stopped believing you'd come. And now I was going to face the one person who had made sure I couldn't. Angela Carter, my daughter, the CEO of Carter Realty. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her last name was still mine, printed in silver letters on the glass doors of the tallest building downtown. But everything else, the company, the money, the power, had been built on what she stole. I parked across the street, watching the tower rise into the clouds. It was sleek, modern, the kind of building that made people look up and think success. But to me, it looked like a tombstone carved from everything I'd lost. As I walked in, the security guard glanced at my rideshare uniform, then at my name on the visitor badge. "Is she expecting you?" he asked. "She will," I replied. He called upstairs. 2 minutes later, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. I rode to the top floor, feeling the air grow colder with each level. When the doors opened, I stepped into a lobby made of glass and chrome. Her receptionist, young, polished, efficient, smiled with professional indifference. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said. "But tell her it's her mother." The smile faltered, a flicker of surprise quickly buried under corporate training. "One moment, please." She made the call, her voice low. Then she looked up. "She'll see you." The office was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city like a throne room in the clouds. At the far end, Angela stood behind a desk of dark wood and steel, dressed in a white blazer that looked like it had never known dust or regret. She didn't move when I entered, didn't smile, didn't even blink. "Mother," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. "What an unexpected development." "Angela." My voice came out steady, though my heart raced. For a moment, we just stared at each other, two women bound by blood and betrayal. The distance between us wasn't measured in feet, but in years of silence. "You've built quite a life," I said softly. "Carter Realty. Offices in 5 states. A magazine cover last year." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile you use at board meetings. "Yes. You should thank me, really. I built an empire from your ashes." The words cut like glass. I looked at her, trying to find the girl I had once rocked to sleep. But that girl was gone. All that remained was the reflection of power and pride, sharpened into cruelty. "Your ashes," I repeated. "That's what you call your father's diner. The house we built together." She shrugged. "Emotions are expensive, Mother. I couldn't afford them." I stepped closer, the sound of my shoes echoing in the polished room. "You stole from us. From him." Her eyes hardened. "I took what was necessary. Dad was sentimental. You were naive. You both lived in the past. I built something real. You built it on lies. Lies don't matter when they pay dividends." There it was, the tone the same one she had used as a teenager when she wanted to end an argument. Dismissive, distant, unreachable. But this time, I had something she didn't expect. Without a word, I reached into my coat pocket and placed a small digital recorder on her desk. I pressed play. Arthur's voice filled the room, frail, trembling, but clear. "Your father didn't sign those documents willingly, Angela. He was coerced. I know because I found the duplicates, your handwriting, not his. You took everything from them." For the first time, Angela's expression cracked. Her hand twitched slightly at her side. "Where did you get that?" "From the man whose company you still profit from," I said. "The one Dad saved from the fire." Angela let out a short, sharp laugh, brittle as glass. "You think some dying old man's story will undo 30 years of success? I don't need it to undo you," I said quietly. "I just need it to reveal you." She leaned forward, resting both hands on the desk. "You really think anyone will care, Mother? You're a rideshare driver. I'm a CEO. No one listens to ghosts from the past." I met her gaze, unflinching. "You didn't build this company, Angela. You burned it. Every brick, every dollar, every lie, it's built from the ashes of the people who loved you most." Her lips curled into a cold smile. "And you You drove strangers to survive. It should have stung. But instead, I felt something unexpected peace. Because she was right. I had driven strangers to survive. And in doing so, I had found my own way back to humanity, something she'd traded long ago for power. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch between us. The city shimmered behind her like a kingdom built on illusion. I didn't come here for revenge, I said finally. I came for truth. And now I have it. Angela tilted her head, studying me like an insect under glass. What will you do then? Run to the press, to the courts. You don't have the resources for a war. No, I said, turning toward the door, but I have time, and time has a way of making rot visible. I paused before leaving. You once told me love was weakness, but you were wrong. Love is endurance. It outlives greed, power, and you. Her laughter followed me down the hall, thin, nervous, trying too hard to sound victorious. But behind it, I heard something else, the smallest crack in her confidence, the sound of a woman who suddenly realized the past wasn't as buried as she thought. When the elevator doors closed, I looked at my reflection in the steel, my face lined, my eyes steady. For the first time in years, I didn't see the woman who'd lost everything. I saw the one who had survived long enough to take it back. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city lights shimmered like fire through the mist. I slipped the recorder back into my pocket and whispered to myself. She built her empire from my ashes, but now I hold the match. Then I walked into the night silent but no longer powerless. The call came just after sunset, when the city outside my window was slipping into that soft gray quiet before the night rush began. I had been sitting in my armchair, the same one David used to fix with duct tape, when it tore, sipping weak tea and staring at nothing in particular. When the phone rang, I almost didn't answer. Miriam Carter. The voice was male, steady, professional. My name is Stephen Keller. I'm Arthur Glenn's attorney. I'm calling regarding the matter we discussed before his passing. I straightened, setting the cup down carefully on the table. Arthur's attorney, I repeated more to myself than to him. Yes, ma'am, he said. Before he died, Mr. Glenn filed a notarized statement affirming that your late husband, David Carter, was coerced into transferring ownership of his trust and assets to your daughter, Angela Carter. Based on his affidavit and the documents you now hold, we have grounds to pursue a full civil claim. The words landed with a weight that made the air feel heavy. Are you saying, I asked slowly, that I could get it all back? Legally, yes, he replied. Everything your husband's estate, the diner property, the assets connected to Carter Realty. The case is solid. Angela's falsified signatures, the witness statements, the timeline, all of it points to financial coercion and fraud. Fraud. The word hit me like a stone. He continued, if we move quickly, we can file a preliminary injunction within 48 hours to freeze her accounts. You would be reinstated as the rightful beneficiary. I stared at the phone as his voice went on, calm and procedural, outlining what justice would look like on paper. Court dates, asset transfers, the restoration of a name long buried under ashes. When he finished, he asked gently, would you like to proceed, Mrs. Carter? I hesitated. The silence stretched. Mrs. Carter. I'll call you in the morning, I whispered. Then I hung up. That night, the house felt too large for one person. Every creak in the walls, every hum of the refrigerator sounded like a question I didn't want to answer. The folder sat on the kitchen table, the legal documents Arthur's lawyer had couriered that afternoon. At the top was the petition for restitution. All it needed was a signature. My signature. I ran my fingers over the dotted line, the ink already prepared in the pen beside it. Just one name and everything she took would return to me. It should have felt righteous. It should have felt like balance. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of a fire holding a match I wasn't sure I wanted to strike. I tried to distract myself, made tea, turned on the radio, even opened the window to let the night air in. But nothing helped. The rain outside had stopped leaving, the world wrapped in stillness. My eyes drifted to the walls bare, except for one old frame above the mantel. Our wedding photo. David and I stood in front of the diner, both wearing aprons, both covered in a thin haze of smoke from the grill behind us. I was laughing. He was looking at me with that same tired, gentle smile he always wore when the world was crumbling, but he refused to let me see. I got up, walked over, and touched the glass. He had died thinking he'd failed us, thinking his choices had destroyed our life. He had carried guilt that wasn't his, and now here I was about to carry vengeance that wasn't mine. The thought hit me like a cold wind. If I signed those papers, I would win everything but lose the last thing David had ever asked of me to forgive, to let go. I sank back into the chair, the pen still in my hand. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, loud and merciless. Arthur's lawyer had said justice was clear, but justice and peace aren't always the same thing. My heart thudded against my ribs as I whispered to the empty room, "What's the point of winning if I have to become her to do it?" The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car passed, splashing through puddles. I looked back at the papers. Then slowly, I picked them up. The motion felt heavier than it should have. The crisp paper crackled between my fingers. The legal stamp at the bottom looked so official, so irreversible. And yet, it wasn't mine. Not the house, not the company, not even the closure. Those things had all burned away years ago. What remained, what had survived the fire, was something Angela would never understand: the choice to stop the cycle. My chest tightened as tears welled in my eyes. "I forgive you," I whispered, "but I won't become you." Then I tore the papers in half. The sound was sharp, almost violent, but freeing. I tore again, smaller and smaller, until the table was covered in white confetti of what could have been. When I was done, I sat in silence. No applause, no relief, just the quiet truth that forgiveness isn't peace, it's sacrifice. 2 days later, the world gave me its verdict. News outlets ran headlines. Miriam Carter declines to pursue case against daughter sources. Suggest private settlement. Former owner of Carter Diner rejects justice, did money change hands? They called me coward. They called me senile. Some said I had been bribed to stay silent. Others said it proved I was complicit all along. My phone rang endlessly. Reporters, gossip shows, strangers demanding to know the price of my forgiveness. I said nothing. Angela didn't deny the rumors, of course. She didn't have to. Silence worked better for her than any lie. The media's noise grew louder each day, but inside my home, it was still. I sat by the window looking out at the street, watching people pass by with umbrellas and shopping bags, their lives untouched by mine. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel vindicated. Just tired, the kind of tired that comes from laying down a weapon you've carried too long. David's picture still hung above the mantel. I lit a small candle beneath it that night, letting the flame dance in the quiet. He died carrying guilt that wasn't his, I whispered. And I won't carry vengeance that isn't mine. The candle flickered, casting shadows that looked like movement in the old photo, his smile glowing faintly behind the glass. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Somewhere people believed I'd sold my silence. Let them. They would never understand that forgiveness, too, demands a price, one far greater than revenge. I closed my eyes, the sound of rain returning soft against the glass, and let the world keep its noise. I had made my choice, and that was enough. The storm outside hadn't stopped in 3 days. It wasn't loud, just relentless, a steady curtain of rain that turned the city into a reflection of itself. From my kitchen window, I could see the water pooling along the sidewalk, carrying leaves, cigarette butts, and yesterday's newspapers downstream. One of those newspapers carried my face. The headlines sat in bold print across the front page of the Morning Ledger: "Woman Fabricates Family Fraud Story. Dementia or Desperation." Underneath was a photo of me leaving the courthouse weeks earlier, caught mid-step, my expression unreadable. The article twisted every detail: how I'd harassed my daughter for money, how my late husband's old friend had manipulated an elderly woman for personal gain, how I'd abandoned legal recourse after a private payout. None of it was true. But truth didn't sell. The phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Journalists, neighbors, even people from the diner's old days calling to ask, "Did you really make it all up?" I stopped answering after the 5th call. Forgiveness doesn't come with applause. It comes with silence. That morning, the television in the corner of the living room buzzed with another talk show segment about the Carter scandal. A young anchor with too perfect hair was laughing with her co-host. They say she showed up at her daughter's office with a decades-old key, claiming it opened a bank vault full of lost money. Sounds like a fairy tale for grown-ups. The audience chuckled. The co-host added, "or a sign of senility." Poor woman, probably confused by grief. Imagine believing a key could unlock 30 years of regret. The laughter grew louder. I turned off the TV. The screen went black, leaving behind a faint reflection, my own face, lined and tired, but not broken. I stared at it for a moment before whispering to no one in particular, it wasn't the key that mattered. That afternoon, I went to the mailbox. A letter was wedged among bills and advertisements. It had no return address, just my name written in uneven cursive. Inside was a single sheet of paper with shaky handwriting. "They don't deserve your peace, Miriam, but you gave it anyway. That's what makes you stronger than them." There was no signature, but I knew whose words they were. Arthur. He must have mailed it before he passed. My throat tightened as I sank onto the front steps, rain dripping from the porch roof onto my shoes. I never got to say thank you. The last time I saw him, he was smiling weakly in the hospital bed, his hands trembling but still warm. "You'll do what's right," he had told me, "even when it costs you." It had. Arthur died before he could witness the storm his kindness unleashed. 2 weeks later, Carter Realty released a public statement. Angela stood behind a podium, poised, radiant, rehearsed. Her voice came through clear on every news channel. "My mother, Miriam Carter, has been struggling with memory decline. We love her dearly, but the claims she made were confused. There was never any fraud, no hidden money, just grief and misunderstanding." I watched the broadcast from my living room. The camera zoomed in as fake sympathy softened her face. "She deserves privacy and peace," she said gently. "I ask that the public respect that." The audience applauded. That applause hurt more than any accusation. Overnight, the narrative solidified. I wasn't the woman wronged. I was the mother who lost her mind. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid me at the market. My rideshare passengers whispered my name, then canceled the ride. Someone spray-painted "liar" on my fence one morning, red paint dripping like blood down the white wood. The landlord called to check in and asked if I might consider moving somewhere quieter. I laughed. It was easier than crying. "Don't worry," I told him. Silence follows me everywhere. One evening, as twilight fell, I walked to the small community garden near the old train station. It was nearly empty this time of year. The air smelled of damp soil and fading lavender. I sat on the same bench where David and I once used to eat lunch from the diner's takeout boxes. The memories came quietly now, not like waves crashing, but like ripples from a stone long thrown. I thought of Angela, of the empire she'd built from the ashes of everything we were. I thought of the reporters who had turned my pain into headlines. And I thought of Arthur, who had believed that truth didn't need to scream to be heard. He was wrong about that, maybe. In this world, silence was a sentence. Still, I whispered a small prayer for him, for David, for Angela, even for myself. "I forgive," I said softly. But sometimes I wish I didn't. A few days later, a letter from the city arrived. It was from the Office of Social Services. Someone had filed a report suggesting I might be unable to live independently. The irony almost made me laugh. I'd spent my life surviving fire's loss, betrayal, and now kindness had made me look unstable. That night, I lit another candle by David's photo. The flame flickered, reflecting off the glass like a heartbeat. "Forgiveness doesn't make you holy," I whispered. "It just makes you alone." The media storm died down eventually. Scandals always do. New stories replaced mine louder and flashier. But the damage lingered quietly. When I walked downtown, people still looked twice. A few smiled politely. Most didn't. I'd gone from being invisible to infamous, then back to invisible again, only this time with a scar. And yet somewhere in that stillness, something inside me settled. They could take my reputation, twist my story, even erase my truth. But they couldn't take the thing I'd fought hardest to protect, the part of me that refused to hate. Arthur's last words stayed with me. "Do what's right, even when it costs you." It had cost me everything: my name, my peace, the comfort of belonging. But as I stood at my window that night, watching the rain slide down the glass, I realized something. Forgiveness isn't about who deserves it. It's about who survives it. And somehow, despite everything, I still had breath in my lungs and fire in my heart. That, I decided, would have to be enough. The storm outside began to fade. I turned off the lights, sat in the dark, and let the quiet become my applause. It had been almost 6 weeks since the storm, the one outside and the one within. The world had moved on. Headlines had faded. Even the red paint on my fence had begun to peel, washed away by time and rain. I had learned to enjoy the quiet again, the mornings especially, the small noises of a world rebuilding itself. Birds on the wire, the hum of distant engines, the kettle whistling softly in the kitchen. That's when the letter came. The envelope was thick, embossed with gold lettering that read, "Keller and Associates, Attorneys at Law." My heart skipped a beat. Arthur's lawyer. Inside was a brief note written in the same steady hand I remembered from our last phone call. "Mrs. Carter, please come to our office at your earliest convenience. There are matters concerning the estate of Mr. Arthur Glenn that require your attention." I sat there for a moment, the letter trembling in my hands. Arthur. Even in death, he was still trying to make things right. The law firm was in a tall brick building downtown, wedged between a bakery and an insurance office. When I walked in, the receptionist looked up, polite but curious. "Mrs. Carter." "Yes," I said softly. "Mr. Keller will see you now." She led me down a hallway lined with bookshelves and framed certificates until we reached a large office filled with morning light. Stephen Keller stood from behind his desk when I entered. He was younger than I'd imagined for a lawyer, maybe in his 40s, with kind eyes and a tone that didn't try too hard to sound professional. "Mrs. Carter," he said, offering a warm handshake. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." He sat down opposite me, opened a leather folder, and took a deep breath. Before his passing, he began, Mr. Glenn updated his will. He left instructions that a portion of his estate be transferred to you upon settlement. I blinked. A portion. He nodded. Yes, though, portion might be an understatement. He turned the document toward me. My eyes scanned the page. $18 million. I froze. My lips parted, but no sound came out. "He left you his shares," Keller explained gently. "All of them. The controlling interest in the Glenn Manufacturing Company. He said it was repayment of a debt your husband refused to take." He handed me a handwritten note, folded neatly, Arthur's familiar cursive on yellow paper. "The world wasn't kind to you, Miriam. Be kinder than it was." The room seemed to blur for a moment. I pressed the note to my chest, trying to breathe through the sudden rush of tears. "Why would he do this?" I whispered. Keller smiled faintly. Because he believed kindness should echo louder than cruelty. That night, I sat at my kitchen table again, surrounded by silence and possibility. $18 million. It wasn't just money, it was redemption, responsibility, and something else I hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. I stared at David's photo above the mantel. "What would you do with it?" I asked the frame. In my mind, I heard his voice, calm and certain as always, "Help someone who needs it more than we did." And so I did. By spring, the paperwork was complete. The lawyers had finalized the transfers, the bank had opened new accounts, and the world once again wanted something from me. But this time, I was ready to give on my own terms. I founded the Carter Promise Foundation, dedicated to women who had been financially abused, silenced, or erased by their own families. The tagline printed on every brochure came from Arthur's final note: "Be kinder than the world was." We started small, a rented office above a grocery store, secondhand furniture volunteers who believed in second chances. The first person I hired was Ruby, the young woman I'd once driven through a rainstorm. When I called her, she was working double shifts at a diner, not unlike the one David and I once owned. "Do you remember me?" I asked. She laughed softly. "You're the lady who gave me her last $20. I'm the lady who now needs your help," I said. "How would you like to run something that could change lives?" There was a pause and then a quiet trembling. Yes, the day Ruby walked into the office for the first time, she was nervous but radiant. She wore a navy blazer too big for her shoulders and held a folder stuffed with ideas. We sat across from each other just like I once had with Angela, but this time there was no power game, no pretense. "Here's the thing," she said, tapping her folder. "We can build something real. Education Housing grants legal aid, a network of women who help each other escape what we survived." "What we survived?" I repeated softly. "That's a good place to start." From that moment, the Carter Promise Foundation began to grow. Within months, Ruby had recruited a board of volunteers, secured partnerships, and hosted our first fundraiser in a church basement. We didn't raise much, just $12,000, but it felt like $1 million. Because for the first time in decades, I was building, not burning. On the day we officially opened our first safe housing program, the mayor's office sent a letter of recognition. Reporters came, but this time they didn't mock. They listened. One asked Mrs. Carter, "What changed after everything you went through?" I smiled, calm and honest. "I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," I said. "It means choosing to build something beautiful on the ruins." They wrote that quote on the front page the next day. Not as scandal, but as hope. That night, I took one last rideshare request. I didn't need the money anymore. I just wanted to drive. The passenger was a young mother with her toddler asleep in the back seat. She thanked me 3 times before getting out, apologizing for being short on cash. As she closed the door, I slipped a $50 bill into her hand. "From someone who once needed the same," I said. She looked confused at first, then smiled with tears in her eyes. When the car was empty again, I looked in the rearview mirror. My reflection was faint in the dim light, but my eyes were steady, alive in a way they hadn't been for years. I drove through the sleeping city, past glass towers and empty streets until the road met the horizon. The radio played softly an old song David used to hum while cleaning the diner grill. For the first time, I didn't feel haunted by ghosts. I felt accompanied by them. Arthur, David, even the younger version of me who had once believed she'd lost everything. They were all still here in the hum of the tires, the whisper of the wind, the soft glow of streetlights against the windshield. As I turned the corner toward home, I whispered the words that had once broken me, but now felt like truth reborn. The world wasn't kind to me, but I learned to be kinder than it was. The car moved on into the night headlights, cutting a quiet path forward toward peace, purpose, and the faint but certain light of a new beginning. The sun had just begun to rise over the skyline, turning the gray river into a ribbon of molten gold. A quiet Sunday morning, the kind that smells like dew and fresh bread, when even the city seems to take a slow breath. I hadn't driven in weeks. The Carter Promise Foundation had grown enough that I no longer needed to take rides to make ends meet. Ruby insisted I retire completely, but that morning I woke up before dawn with an odd ache, a longing to drive one more time. Maybe it was nostalgia, maybe something else. I made tea, put on my old blue cardigan, and opened the rideshare app. My finger hovered over the screen. For a moment, I almost changed my mind, but then I smiled and tapped Go Online. Within seconds, a notification chimed. Pickup 0.8 miles away, passenger Emily R. The address led me to a small apartment complex near the university. Outside, a young woman stood waiting with a backpack and a paper coffee cup. She couldn't have been more than 19. She waved when she saw me. "Hi, are you Miriam?" "Yes, dear." "That's me." She climbed into the back seat, humming softly as she buckled her seatbelt. "Thanks for picking me up so early. I've got an interview downtown." "Big day?" I asked, starting the car. She laughed nervously. "Yeah, it's for an internship. My mom keeps saying it's my chance to break the cycle." I smiled. Mothers know a thing or two about cycles. She leaned forward between the seats. "Oh, I forgot you probably don't know, but my mom's kind of obsessed with this foundation. The Carter Promise, ever heard of it?" I froze for just a heartbeat, then nodded. I might have. She went on, oblivious to my silence. "Yeah, they helped her go back to school after my dad left. She used to cry every night when she thought I was asleep, but that program, it changed everything. Now she works at a bank, and I'm the first in our family to go to college." The car was quiet for a moment, except for the hum of the engine. Then I said softly, "That's wonderful. You must be proud." She grinned. "I am, and grateful. If it weren't for that woman, Mrs. Carter, I think her name was my mom, says we'd still be living in the shelter." The morning light caught in the side mirror, bright and warm. I adjusted it just enough to see my reflection older, lined and smiling. "Your mom sounds strong," I said. "Very strong." "She is," Emily said. She told me the woman who started the foundation said something like, "Kindness is power when the world calls it weakness." That really stuck with her. I felt my throat tighten. Did she now? "Yeah." She said one day she wants to meet her and say thank you. I kept my eyes on the road, blinking away the mist that began to gather. I think that woman would be very moved to hear that. We drove in comfortable silence after that. The city woke around us, shops opening, buses rumbling by children tugging on their parents' hands. I watched it all pass through the windshield like a film I'd seen before, but never tired of. There was a time when I'd thought forgiveness was the end of everything, a quiet surrender, a closing chapter. But in that moment, I understood it was the opposite. Forgiveness wasn't the end. It was the bridge that allowed others to cross. Emily's stop was near the riverbank where the glass buildings reflected the morning light like mirrors of the sky. As we approached the curb, she gathered her things. "Thank you for the ride, Mrs. Miriam," she said cheerfully. "Wish me luck," I said with a smile, "has nothing to do with it. You're ready." She grinned, waved, and disappeared into the crowd. I didn't start the car right away. Instead, I sat there watching the river ripple under the rising sun. A boat drifted lazily across the water, its engine a low hum that faded into the distance. I thought of David, the way his laugh filled the diner on Sunday mornings. I thought of Arthur, who had believed in kindness until the very end. Of Ruby, whose courage built something out of nothing. And even of Angela, who had taught me that pain can be inherited, but so can redemption. Life had taken everything once my house, my husband, my name. But somehow, in its strange, unrelenting way, it had given back something far greater. Peace. Not the kind that comes from victory or revenge, but the quiet peace that comes from knowing you've done what you could, and that it was enough. I opened the app one last time and pressed Go Offline. The soft chime echoed through the car like the closing note of a long song. I set the phone aside, turned off the ignition, and stepped out. The air was cool and smelled faintly of salt and sunlight. Across the river, the city glowed. New buildings rose where the old diner once stood, and somewhere out there, people were living lives that would never know my name. And that was all right. I walked to the edge of the water, my reflection rippling beside me. The wrinkles on my face caught the light like delicate threads of silver. "I used to think forgiveness was weakness," I whispered. "Turns out, it's the only form of power that heals." The words floated away on the wind carried across the river to places unseen. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of the morning settle over me. For the first time in years, the weight on my chest was gone. And that was the story of Miriam Carter, a woman who lost everything but found peace by giving it away. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about setting others free. It's about setting yourself free one quiet act of kindness at a time. If this story touched you, take a moment to breathe and think about who in your life deserves a second chance, including you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always love hearing your stories. They remind me that healing doesn't happen alone. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need this message today. Because sometimes one story, one comment can change someone's life.